Somewhere along a nameless stretch of trail in the American West, a woman is burying her husband in frozen ground she cannot properly dig. She has no coffin. She has no priest. She has snow, a shovel, and children waiting behind her who need her to survive what she is about to do next. History will barely remember her name. And yet, without women like her, the story of the American frontier simply does not happen. No settlements survive their first winter. No wagon trains reach Oregon. No mining towns become cities. No mission outposts hold. For 2 centuries, the frontier has been sold to us as a story of men, of gunslingers, generals, and railroad barons riding into the unknown. But underneath that story is another one, quieter, harder, and in many ways more remarkable. It is the story of the women who kept the lights on. The ones who delivered the babies, buried the dead, carried the mail through blizzards, fed the hungry, and, when everything fell apart, simply refused to let the settlement die. Tonight, we go looking for them. To understand why these women vanished from the record, you first have to understand how the frontier myth was built in the first place. In the decades after the Civil War, dime novels, traveling Wild West shows, and later Hollywood-turned westward expansion into a spectacle of rugged individualism, a story that needed a hero, usually a man on a horse, usually alone, usually with a gun. But the real frontier was never built by lone riders. It was built by households. By families. By entire communities that lived or died based on whether someone in the group knew how to set a broken bone, stretch a week's worth of food into a month, deliver a breech berth in a dirt floor cabin, or talk a panicked group of desperate strangers out of turning on each other when things grew truly dire. Women were doing that work everywhere, and much of it left no monument, no statue, no plaque, no line in a schoolbook. It left only letters, court records, gravestones, and the occasional newspaper mention buried on page 6, if it was recorded at all. Piecing their stories back together means reading against the grain of history itself, and what you find, once you start looking, is staggering. Let's start in 1836, on a trail that did not yet fully exist as any kind of formal route. Her name was Narcissa Prentice Whitman, and she was 27 years old when she did something American society had insisted was flatly impossible for a woman of her time. She crossed the continent overland, by wagon and on horseback, through territory white Americans still called unknown, alongside her new husband. Before she ever set foot on the trail, prominent voices back east had told her outright that respectable women simply did not belong on such a journey, that the trip would break her body, that no white woman could physically survive months of exposure, hunger, and constant strain across mountain passes and high desert plains. She went anyway. Narcissa Whitman became one of the very first white women known to cross the North American continent overland, traveling west as a missionary alongside her husband, Dr. Marcus Whitman, under the sponsorship of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Her caravan pushed out from what was then genuinely considered the ragged edge of American settlement, joining a slow, grinding column of animals, wagons, and men heading into land most Americans back east had never even seen accurately drawn on a map. She described the caravan herself as something like a moving village, with hundreds of animals and dozens of men strung out across the prairie in a line that must have seemed to stretch forever. What Narcissa Whitman built once she finally arrived was not a fort, not a military garrison, but something arguably far harder to sustain over time, a functioning settlement planted in the middle of Cayuse territory, built on a foundation of trust that was fragile from the very first year. The mission she and Marcus established, called Wailatpu, sat near the Walla Walla River in what is today Washington State, roughly 6 miles from Fort Walla Walla. As the Oregon Trail matured into a genuine, well-worn migration route, the mission grew into one of the most important waypoints on the entire corridor. Annual wagon trains began rolling through by the hundreds, and Wailatpu quickly became a popular wintering-over stop, a place where exhausted, half-starved travelers could rest and recover before pushing on toward the Willamette Valley. Think about what that actually meant for one household to absorb. Narcissa was not simply keeping her own family alive in unfamiliar, often hostile terrain. She was, in effect, running an ad hoc way station for hundreds of strangers a year, feeding them, sheltering them, nursing the sick among them, all while trying to sustain a mission whose original purpose was to serve the Cayuse people who had lived on that exact land for countless generations before a single wagon ever rolled through. That tension, between serving the people whose land it truly was, and serving the relentless flood of American settlers pouring through every single season, is exactly what made Narcissa Whitman's story so complicated, and ultimately, so tragic. In her own private letters, she confessed that she found her home uncomfortably crowded, the extra household labor exhausting, and the friction between rival missionary families deeply disheartening. This was not some romanticized frontier idyll. It was punishing, unglamorous labor most of us today would never willingly sign up for: endless cooking, endless nursing, endless emotional caretaking for people who kept arriving and rarely left enough behind to help her keep going. And the Cayuse were watching all of it unfold. They saw missionaries who had claimed to come and serve them instead pour their energy into guiding white settlers safely through, feeding and sheltering the newcomers all winter long, while offering the Cayuse themselves comparatively little in return. The mission that Narcissa had poured more than a decade of her life into was, in the eyes of the very people it was supposedly built to help, slowly becoming something closer to a staging ground for their own displacement, and that resentment did not stay quiet forever. By the fall of 1847, a devastating measles epidemic tore through the Cayuse community near Wailatpu, killing large numbers of native people while the white settlers who had unknowingly carried the disease westward largely survived it. The epidemic, combined with Marcus Whitman's inability to save the dying, became the spark that finally ignited years of buried anger. On the night of November 29, a group of Cayuse men, grieving and convinced the mission had ultimately betrayed them, attacked Wailatpu. 13 people were killed in the assault that followed, including both Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. Narcissa did not die of exposure, or starvation, or any of the thousand quiet dangers of ordinary frontier life. She died because the settlement she had spent 11 years holding together finally collapsed under the weight of the very migration she herself had helped make possible. It is a brutal irony, and historians still argue fiercely over how to remember her, as a heroic pioneer who defied impossible odds, or as a painful symbol of everything colonization cost the people who were already home long before she arrived. What is not in dispute is the scale of the consequence. The killings at Wailatpu helped pull the entire Oregon Territory under tighter American military and political control, and set off a chain of events that eventually forced the Columbia Plateau tribes onto reservations. One woman's 11 years on a remote mission outpost helped redirect the entire trajectory of a region larger than most European countries. And most Americans today have never once heard her name spoken aloud. If Narcissa Whitman's story shows what it meant to build a settlement out of nothing, the story of the Donner Party shows something almost the opposite: what it meant to try to keep a family alive after everything had already gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. In the spring of 1846, roughly 80 emigrants set out from Springfield, Illinois, chasing a so-called shortcut to California that promised to shave weeks off the punishing overland journey. The shortcut turned out to be a disaster in almost every practical sense, costing the group critical time they could not afford to lose, and by the time the party finally reached the towering wall of the Sierra Nevada in late October, an early and brutal winter storm sealed the mountain pass shut behind them like a door slamming closed. What followed became one of the most infamous survival ordeals in American history, and at its emotional center stood a woman named Tamsen Donner. Tamsen was married to George Donner, one of the expedition's principal organizers, and when disaster struck the party in full, she made a choice that would define how she was remembered forever afterward. By the time rescue parties finally began reaching the stranded camps in the depths of that brutal winter, Tamsen was still healthy enough to walk out with them. The rescuers urged her, more than once, to save herself while she still could. She refused. Her husband George was dying slowly of an infected hand wound that had turned gangrenous and untreatable, and Tamsen would not abandon him to die alone in a frozen camp at the edge of the known world. Instead, she sent her children ahead with the rescue parties, one small group at a time, entrusting them to strangers rather than risk losing them to the mountain herself, while she stayed behind with George until the very end. Consider the calculus behind that decision for a moment. Every single day she waited was another day closer to her own death by starvation and exposure, and she understood that math perfectly well. She stayed anyway. Only after George finally died did Tamsen attempt to cross the mountains alone, and she never made it out. Her body was never recovered, and to this day, no one knows exactly how her final hours unfolded. Meanwhile, further down the same doomed trail, another woman from that identical wagon train was proving that grit could look entirely different depending on the family and the circumstances surrounding it. Virginia Reed was only a young teenager, the stepdaughter of James Reed, one of the expedition's most controversial figures, a man who had been formally banished from the party earlier in the journey after killing another emigrant in a violent trailside confrontation. Despite that banishment, and despite the deep resentment many in the party held toward the Reed family afterward, the Reeds became one of only 2 families in the entire Donner Party to survive the ordeal without losing a single member. That survival did not happen by accident. It happened because the women left behind in that household, Virginia's mother, Margaret Reed, and Virginia herself, held the family together through months of starvation and terror while the family's patriarch was hundreds of miles away, desperately organizing a rescue effort from the California side of the mountains. Virginia would go on, decades later, to write one of the only detailed first-hand accounts of the entire catastrophe, a memoir titled Across the Plains in the Donner Party. Her narrative remains, to this day, one of the most widely cited first-hand sources historians have ever had for understanding exactly what happened in those mountains that winter. A teenage girl, half-starved and terrified beyond anything most of us will ever experience, became one of the primary reasons this story survived in any accurate form at all. Of the roughly 81 people who entered those mountains that autumn, only 45 ultimately survived, and 32 of them were children. Children who survived, in no small part, because women inside that camp made agonizing, impossible decisions night after night about food, warmth, and who would be carried out first when strength finally began to run out. The story of the Donner Party is usually told through the lens of its horror, the starvation, the desperation, the grim and uncomfortable math of survival that has fascinated and repulsed Americans for generations. But strip away the sensational headlines and what remains is a quieter story about women refusing to let entire family lines simply disappear into the snow. That refusal is easy to romanticize from the comfort of a warm living room. It is far harder to actually imagine living through. Not every frontier woman was fighting the wilderness itself. Some were fighting a system that had never intended for them to be free at all, in a country that was still deciding, violently, what freedom even meant. In 1818, somewhere in the deep South, a girl was born into slavery under the name Bridget. The world would eventually come to know her as Biddy Mason. She was separated from her parents as a young child and sold multiple times over, laboring across plantations in Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina before she had even reached adulthood. Somewhere inside that brutal childhood, she quietly absorbed skills that would one day change the entire course of her life. She learned herbal medicine and midwifery from older enslaved women around her, knowledge she would later turn into an independent career once freedom finally arrived. In 1847, her enslaver forced her and dozens of others on a grueling, 1,700-mile overland trek westward, eventually toward California. Along that march, Biddy was responsible for setting up and breaking camp each day, cooking every meal, herding cattle across open country, and serving as the group's primary midwife, all of it performed while she herself remained legally enslaved. That march eventually brought her into California, a free state under its own new constitution, and that single geographic fact changed absolutely everything for her. Word reached Biddy and the other enslaved people traveling with her that California had formally outlawed slavery, and members of the local free black community quietly encouraged her to sue for her own emancipation, and for that of her children. It was an enormous risk to take. Under California law at the time, black Californians were not even permitted to testify in court on their own behalf. But a chain of allies slowly formed around her case, a free black rancher's family, a sympathetic local sheriff, and eventually a Los Angeles judge willing to actually apply the letter of the law. On January 21, 1856, Los Angeles County District Judge Benjamin Hayes ruled decisively in her favor, freeing Biddy Mason along with 13 members of her extended family in one sweeping decision. It remains, to this day, one of the largest freedom lawsuits in American history, decided a full year before the infamous Dred Scott ruling would attempt to slam that same door shut on a national scale. What Biddy Mason did next is the part of her story that almost never makes it into the textbooks. She did not merely survive freedom, she built an empire out of it, in a frontier town that barely existed yet in any recognizable form. Working relentlessly as a nurse and midwife, she became so trusted and so in demand that she eventually delivered babies across every ethnic and economic line in early Los Angeles, at a time when very few professionals of any kind would cross those lines willingly. Every dollar she earned, she saved with remarkable discipline. And slowly, deliberately, methodically, she began buying small parcels of land in a city that had almost nothing built on it yet. As the tiny pueblo of Los Angeles grew year after year into a genuine American city, her modest property holdings transformed into extraordinarily valuable urban real estate, and by the end of her life she had accumulated a fortune approaching $300,000, an almost unthinkable sum for anyone in that era, let alone for a formerly enslaved black woman who began adulthood with no formal education, no inherited wealth, and no legal last name of her own. She used a substantial portion of that fortune to found schools, churches, and relief funds for the poor of Los Angeles, regardless of their race or background. A woman born into slavery with no name the law would even recognize became, within a single generation, one of the most important philanthropists in the early history of a city that did not yet know what it was going to become. There is one more woman whose story absolutely belongs in this collection, and she is, frankly, one of the most quietly extraordinary figures to ever work the American frontier in any capacity. Her name was Mary Fields, and by the time most people in Montana knew her, they simply called her Stagecoach Mary. Born into slavery in Hickman County, Tennessee, around 1832, Mary Fields eventually made her way north after emancipation, working odd jobs, laundry, and domestic labor before landing at a convent in Ohio and, later, at St. Peter's Mission near Cascade, Montana. At the mission she handled maintenance, repairs, gardening, laundry, and the hauling of heavy supplies, the kind of unglamorous, physically exhausting labor that quietly keeps any remote outpost functioning day after day, season after season. When friction with the mission eventually led to her departure, she tried her hand at opening a small restaurant in town. It failed within roughly 10 months, not because she couldn't run it competently, but because, as those who knew her later explained, she kept feeding customers who simply could not afford to pay, and the business bled itself dry through her own generosity. Then, in 1895, in her early 60s, an age at which most people of that era were long past taking on grueling physical labor of any kind, Mary Fields did something remarkable. She became the first black woman contracted by the United States Postal Service to deliver mail on a star route, a demanding 34-mile round trip between Cascade and St. Peter's Mission across some of the harshest terrain in Montana. The job meant rutted dirt roads, ferocious winter storms rolling down off the Rockies, and the constant, real threat of wolves descending from the surrounding mountains, a genuinely treacherous route by any measure, even for a much younger person. She drove it with a team of horses and a mule she affectionately named Moses, and when the snow grew too deep for the wagon to pass, she did not simply turn back and wait for better weather. On many winter days she left her team behind on the drifted road entirely and finished the delivery on foot, strapped into snowshoes, throwing the heavy mail sacks over her shoulder and walking as far as 10 miles back to the depot through blinding, freezing conditions. One historian even documented an account of her getting caught in a sudden blizzard so severe that she had to stop the wagon completely and pace back and forth through the entire night, simply to keep herself from freezing to death where she stood. And through all of it, across 8 consecutive years spanning 2 separate federal contracts, she never missed a single day of delivery. Not once, in any season, in any weather. In a job built entirely on reliability, in conditions that could and did kill capable young men every single winter, a woman well into her 60s simply refused to fail at it. The town of Cascade came to genuinely love her for it. She even became something of an unofficial mascot for the local baseball team, and locals reportedly declared her birthday something close to an informal town holiday. When she eventually retired from the mail route, she opened a small laundry business and spent her final years as a beloved, unmistakable fixture of the community she had served so faithfully for so long. When she finally died in 1914, the entire town of Cascade turned out for her funeral, a level of communal grief rarely afforded to anyone, let alone a formerly enslaved woman who had arrived in Montana with nothing but her own 2 hands. These 4 women never met each other. They lived in different decades, in different territories, under wildly different circumstances entirely, a missionary's wife on the Oregon Trail, a mother frozen into the granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada, a formerly enslaved woman building a fortune out of nothing in early Los Angeles, and a mail carrier defying blizzard after blizzard in Montana well into her 60s. But look closely, and a pattern begins to emerge. None of them are remembered the way the men of their era are remembered. There is no mountain named for Narcissa the way there might be for a male explorer who happened to walk the same trail. There is no statue of Tamsen Donner standing quietly in a national park, marking the spot where she made her final choice. Biddy Mason's name is barely taught outside of Los Angeles classrooms, despite the fact that a downtown park now bears her name. And Mary Field spent most of the 20th century as little more than a regional folk legend, her story passed around as colorful local trivia, before historians finally confirmed her official place in the Federal Postal Record all the way back in 2006, nearly a full century after her death. And these 4 women are only the ones whose stories happen to survive at all, preserved by pure luck, or a stray letter, or a court record someone bothered to keep. For every Narcissa Whitman, there were dozens of unnamed missionary wives who held remote mission outposts together for years and left no letters behind for anyone to find. For every Tamsen Donner, there were countless mothers on countless wagon trains who made those exact same impossible calculations about food, warmth, and who gets carried out first, women whose names exist today only on a faded family Bible page, or a half-legible gravestone somewhere along a trail that has long since disappeared under highway asphalt. For every Biddy Mason, there were formerly enslaved women who fought for their own freedom in courtrooms that kept no transcript worth preserving. For every Mary Fields, there were midwives, teachers, laundresses, and lone homesteaders who quietly kept entire towns fed, educated, and functioning, women remembered by absolutely no one today, simply because nobody in their own time thought their labor was worth writing down. This is really the central, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the entire American frontier myth. It was never actually built by lone riders on horseback, chasing glory across an empty landscape. It was built by households, and households do not survive on courage alone, they survive on relentless, exhausting, almost entirely invisible labor, performed overwhelmingly by women who were never expected to receive credit for any of it in the first place. The frontier needed someone to deliver the babies when the nearest doctor was 3 hard days' ride away. It needed someone to keep an isolated mission fed and functioning through a brutal winter, to hold a shattered family together after a father was buried in the snow, to fight a hostile legal system for the basic right to simply exist as a free human being, to carry the mail through a howling blizzard because an entire town's survival quietly depended on that delivery arriving on schedule. Those jobs fell overwhelmingly, disproportionately, to women, and the men who eventually sat down to write the history books afterwards simply didn't think to mention it. So the next time you watch a Western unfold on screen, or read a paragraph about westward expansion in a textbook, or try to picture what the frontier actually looked and felt like day to day, remember that behind every fort, every mission, every wagon train, and every scrappy little settlement that somehow managed to survive its first brutal winter, there was very likely a woman holding the whole fragile thing together with nothing but sheer will, hard-won practical skill, and a flat refusal to let it all fall apart. Narcissa Whitman crossed an entire continent that everyone around her swore she couldn't survive. Tamsen Donner stayed behind in the snow rather than abandon the man she loved. Biddy Mason turned the horror of enslavement into an empire built on hard-earned freedom and quiet generosity. Mary Fields, well into her 60s, outworked men half her age through some of the harshest winters the American West could throw at her. None of them ever asked to be forgotten. History simply never bothered to remember. If you had to guess, how many more stories like these are still sitting unread in old letters, court records, and family Bibles scattered across this country, waiting for someone to finally go looking? Tell us in the comments which of these 4 women's stories struck you the hardest, and why you think history chose to leave her out.